All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you joining us wherever you may be. Thank you for joining SpecterOps for our presentation on trends in identity attack path management today. My name is Luke Luckett, Director of Product Marketing here at SpecterOps, and I am pleased to be joined by Justin Kohler, our Chief Product Officer, and Jared Atkinson, our Chief Technology Officer. And what we wanted to talk with you about today is sharing some research that we worked on with analyst firm Omdia earlier this year to survey more than 500 senior cybersecurity decision makers on how they think and feel about attack path management, especially as it comes to identities. Next slide, please. I'm going to quickly go over a couple of key findings before we dive into the demographics and then more thoroughly into the data. Uh, Among the more than 500 respondents that we had, we asked about the increasingly complex threat landscape. And some of the key findings that we identified were that nearly 60% of organizations have increased their annual spend on identity security in the past year, with more than 100% of respondents also reporting at least one security incident in the past year.
Oops, too far. Sorry.
We also found that the foundations for identity-based attack path management solutions are wholly in place in many organizations. 59% report that they are actively researching or have already implemented an identity-based attack path management solution. But the need for integration drives collaboration between IT and cybersecurity teams. More than half of organizations that we polled ranked attack path management integration as a top priority for next year. One thing I wanted to also note is there is measurable opportunity for startups to innovate more quickly and deliver real-time attack path visibility to meet the needs of identity and security teams.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna share why why the why behind these numbers. So 60% investing in this, or 59% actively researching. That's because it's a very big problem. And I'll give you some numbers behind that. So first, let's just start with what an attack path is, for those that are not aware or just want to know our definition of that problem. So I'm not going to read every word here, but basically, attack paths are the ways that adversaries take initial access and turn that into privileged access. So they route through user behaviors and configurations within the identity layer to go from very low privilege to very high privileged. So that's basically what an attack path is from our perspective. Jared.
Yeah, this is just an example of one attack path, but one of the kind of things that you'll notice as we progress through the presentation is that organizations often have several millions or billions. This is what Justin's going to get into next, but the aggregation of these attack paths is what we kind of liken to identity risk. So as we start to think about what is identity risk, or how does risk manifest in kind of the identity space, we're seeing that as a measurable thing associated with these attack paths.
Yeah, so attack paths are created through relationships that apply across identities. Those create findings if in attack path management products like BloodHound Enterprise. Those usually apply to different critical identities or resources like tier 0 or global admin, or those sorts of like high privileged identities. And those are within different environments, whether they be on-prem or cloud. The attack path number is a good way of thinking about this is think about the relationships and identities as like the roads between cities. And attack paths are the unique routes you can take through the use of those roads to reach different cities. So the numbers are ridiculous. So I'll start with like a company with 5,000 identities. Now, identities are not just people, they're not just heartbeats. This is like non-human or human identities. You'll have around 5 million attack paths. So again, to put this in perspective, 5,000 identities is probably around 1,000 employee company, and they have 5 million attack paths. We know this because we calculate this across our customer base, and we're taking this, excuse me, this average across all of our customers. So the combinations of different routes that an attacker can use once they get in the environment are massive. And this only gets worse as the company gets larger. So this exacerbates quite large. So that 752 million number is when you have 40,000 identities. Again, that's probably only around 10,000 employees. So for those of you who have potentially hundreds of thousands of employees, unfortunately, your attack path count probably answers in the billions, like Dr. Evil. It sounds like a ridiculous number, but it's true. Again, just think of like the different possible combinations of routes you can use by using different roads. That kind of starts to address the problem or kind of shine light on how big of a problem this is and why people are investing in it right now. So another way of thinking about identities, so like attack paths is very like attacker term and stuff, but another way of thinking about this is you might have a concept of how you've architected your environment. And this is a sideways view. Maybe you think of this vertically. Maybe you have like high privilege stuff at the top. You have this middle layer that you're trying to segment away, and then you have like the user layer. Basically, everybody thinks that they're doing some sense of segmentation within their identity layer. Attack paths are just violations of that. It's just how we cross those boundaries through hidden configurations or user behaviors. So hopefully trying to demystify this term attack path, it's really like you've designed your organization. I'm showing you where you are not doing that correctly.
One thing to keep in mind, if you go back, Justin, is
Yeah.
that, well, control of the resource. So a user has control of a resource, and they could usually parlay that into gaining privileged access. Privileged access can then be used in the opposite direction to then access more resources, right? So we kind of refer to this as the identity snowball or access accumulation. And this is a big concern for organizations because attackers view privileged access as a means to an end, not the end itself. So a lot of times we'll see in a red team operation that the goal is like, can you get domain admin? But domain admin is, or like privileged access is acting as a proxy for whatever ultimate goal the attacker actually has, which usually involves some sort of impact on some sort of business line. It might have to do with access to data, things of that nature.
All right. Thank you, guys. Great setup for attack path management. I wanted to quickly note, in case you didn't see in the chat, that this session is being recorded. We will be sharing a link to the recording and these slides to everyone who registered shortly after the webinar concludes. And we are also taking Q&A. So if you have questions, please post them into the Q&A section of Zoom, and we will take a look towards the end of the session. All right, so let's talk a little bit about demographics. So this survey was fielded by Omdia in early January of 2025. We had more than 500 respondents across 3 global regions, including Europe, North America, and Australia. And company sizes ranged from companies with just over 10,000 employees up to those with more than 50,000 employees. And we covered pretty much the whole spectrum of industry verticals, from travel and hospitality to healthcare to banking and financial services, up to our largest segment that responded, which was retail and e-commerce. So we definitely are seeing attack path management as a problem, or attack paths as a problem across the different sectors.
I actually kind of think this is funny because this more or less matches our customer profile, which is anybody with identities. Shocker. But we also have a high concentration of like technology, finance, manufacturing, healthcare for sure. The interesting thing though is I think the respondents are actually underrepresented of what we see on the education side. So like we have actually a lot of universities as customers. If you think about like they have student accounts and like the different ways that student accounts may or may not be able to access other things in the environment is kind of a key concern. So some of this is interesting, but basically anybody with an identity system will have this problem.
All right, and last thing just to mention is that respondents needed to have decision-making capabilities within their teams. So they either owned domain system management strategy or system solutions procurement, cybersecurity strategy, or cyber purchasing decisions, or be a decision maker in identity and access management or Microsoft Windows or related services strategies. The majority, or 57% of our respondents were director level, 28% vice presidents, and 16% C level. So primarily CIOs or CISOs. 34% of respondents consider themselves in the security camp, and the remainder consider themselves in the IT camp. All right, so let's dive into the first section of data review. So we asked organizations what their top cyber priorities are over the next 12 months. And what we found were that addressing challenges related to staffing and skills shortages came in top, followed closely by ransomware and other types of risks. But enhancing visibility into attack paths and privilege relationships came in at number 3.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to point out is that, well, the third most popular option refers to attack paths explicitly. I think we could double click on that reducing risk from ransomware, including phishing, business email compromise, and credential theft note there. And we start to think about credential theft. What is that? Well, that's one of the main primitives that attackers use to laterally move or execute an attack path, right? Additionally, ransomware spread, we've seen several documented incidents where ransomware was spread via attack paths. In fact, they were using very similar methodology to kind of the inverse of what we're using when we talk about, for instance, attack path management with BloodHound Enterprise. And so when we start talking about reducing risk of ransomware, one of the best ways to do that, in our opinion, is through attack path management.
Yeah, I mean, it goes further down this list too, right? So like improving incident response times and capabilities. For example, like one way you could do that is if you understand the paths an attacker would take, or like improving response times. Well, how about responding to less incidents because you like are locking these things down from being used in the first place? Again, you're always going to have some incidents, but can we turn that inevitable breach into a less impactful breach because of the use of attack paths?
All right. Next, we asked respondents about the following security technology categories and how their organization's spending has changed over the past year. So data security came in at number 1 with change, and identity security came in at number 2. The net takeaway here is that almost 60% of orgs increased their identity security spend in the past year.
Yeah, and it's important to note that these things are related. They're interconnected, right? So in modern environments, I think the access to data is often governed via identities and the privileges that are granted to them. So a major problem that we see in the data security space is that organizations often practice what I refer to as enough privilege rather than least privilege. This is where often you'll say, what is this identity, this either human account or non-human identity, need to have access to? What resources do they need to access? And so then you'll validate that they actually do, in fact, have the access that they need. But least privilege is actually a negative test, right? It requires you to say, not only do you have access to the resources that you need access to, but I also have to validate that you do not have access to any additional resources that you don't need access to, right? Everybody always skips that last part. And so there's situations, and we see this on the red team side all the time, where legitimate users can go years without realizing that they have unintended access. So they have that enough privilege and it doesn't affect their job, but they have a bunch of privilege that they don't need. For instance, we see situations where domain users or authenticated users are in the domain admins group. And you could go years without anybody ever realizing that. The problem is that that's the first question the attacker asks, which is, what I have control of this identity, what access do I have as a result of that? And so they're going to find that very quickly, as opposed to a legitimate user who's not asking those types of questions.
All right, now we'll dive into the current state of identity practices. We asked respondents which products are currently deployed as components of your identity security stack. And we found that access management and privileged access management, including MFA, were foundational components of an identity security stack.
Yeah, so in our analysis, we've actually found that attack path management as a concept complements many of these kind of more traditional identity security solutions. So one that maybe we could double click on is this privileged access management. There's this problem that is kind of related to this enough versus least privilege idea, where organizations often have this delta between expected privilege and actual privilege, right? And so imagine that there's better and worse examples or representative identities for what a privileged identity is or what a unprivileged identity is, right? there's better examples. So the best example, for instance, might be a domain admin, right? That's a really good example. Everybody is protecting their domain admins. The problem is that when you start to get towards kind of like the margins of the category of privileged accounts, you start to lose track of, you know, what actually is privileged and what's not. And so tools like Bloodhound or attack path management, understanding the attack graph as a whole and what identities have access to what resources really helps you to understand what accounts actually have privilege and therefore should be protected.
We next asked which products are currently used to secure identity directory services and found that endpoint detection and response, as well as privileged access management, tend to be the most commonly used approaches to securing identity directory services.
I'd say like on this one, there's three specific ones that are reactive and there's two that are proactive. So privilege access management would be an example of a proactive control or a preventative control. You're trying to block access to that credential before it's used. Jared will go way more in depth on kind of differences or like residual risk that may come out of the use of PAM. But the other three, like EDR, ITDR, and endpoint protection, are all about trying to catch the actor after they have, you know, they've gotten into the environment and they're on their way to executing that attack. Those are good, and you should have detective controls, but reliance solely upon those is kind of like trying to find somebody going through your house, leaving the doors open, and trying to catch them with Ring doorbells on all your doors. Or, you know, like your open doors. Why not just shut the door? That's what we're saying with identity attack path management. Close those doors and have fewer areas for the adversary to walk through so that your detection tools can be more effective. You're looking at fewer events, your people are looking at fewer alerts. And so those are more effective through the use of like shutting down these attack paths.
Yeah, I think to kind of really dig into that, I for those that follow kind of my work, you know that I like to draw analogies from kind of more traditional sciences that have a longer history of understanding the world, I guess. And there's a neuroscientist named Carl Friston in the UK, and he has this idea called the free energy principle. And one of the things that he talks about is how organisms manage surprise. So imagine that in cybersecurity, a surprise is a security incident, right? So it's a bad thing. It's creating chaos. You have to deal with it. Friston kind of describes that there's two ways that organisms deal with managing surprise because you want to reduce surprise. You kind of want to be in a steady state, generally speaking. The first is to increase your ability to predict how the world will unfold, right? And so the analog in cybersecurity is detection, right? You want to get better data. You want to have better analytics. You want to be able to make better predictions about what's happening or understand what you're seeing. But the second, right, and that goes with EDR, ITDR, so on and so forth. The second is to reduce the decision space, right? And this is talking about, for instance, pruning attack paths, right? So if there's 5 billion attack paths or 5 million attack paths, we'll use the lower example. That means that if an attacker is in our environment, there's 5 million different things they could be doing. There's 5 different paths they can take. If I cut that down to 100,000, right, because I've pruned those different findings, I've reduced those attack paths. Now the detection aspect, right, the prediction aspect actually becomes easier, right? And so that's how we think that attack path management and, for instance, detection and response can really complement each other because you're making the detection and response problem much simpler to solve as a result of your attack path management approach.
I think I stole this earlier. I mentioned it earlier, but this is why we say breaches are inevitable. Again, the numbers here, but impactful breaches are avoidable. We can stop the adversary from moving beyond the privilege zone or the access layer that they have today, and prevent that like lateral move or the escalation of privilege if you understand the attack paths that they're going to use.
And this is a play off of the assume breach kind of paradigm where I think at SpecterOps, we're big subscribers to that, which is attackers are going to find a way to get initial access. The question is what can they do with that access? And we generally believe that attack paths are the thing that describes what attackers can do once they gain that initial access. And if we manage those, then we're able to reduce the impact of the breach. Nobody really cares, generally speaking, if a single computer is compromised. you care about the aggregate of the impact, right? And so it's if you leave them on an island, then it doesn't necessarily matter as much to the organization as if they're able to take over the entire domain, for instance.
All right. Next, we asked respondents, who is primarily responsible for identity directory services at your organization? And we found that IT ops or infrastructure teams came in at number 1, security ops team came in at number 2, and the IAM team came in at number 3. But if you jump to the next slide, we also asked who's primarily responsible for identity management at your organization. And in this case, we saw IAM team come in at number 1, with the IT ops and infrastructure team at number 2, and the security ops team at number 3.
This makes sense, like especially what we see in customer environments, where you'll have, like, think on the IT side. If you're a hybrid environment, you might have an AD admin who manages AD and all the different components there. You might have an Azure admin that manages that, and an AWS admin that manages that, and so on and so forth. And then you have an identity and access management team who's using some IGA like SailPoint or another product to provision users to access those things. But there's a disconnect. There's a whole lot of weeds in each one of those underlying components that are understood maybe by those individual admins, but not understood at the IAM layer. Again, that's not their role. They're trying to provision access and making sure that they're trying to provision enough access to get their job done. But again, not least privilege, like Jared was talking about earlier. I also think this is interesting, like, who owns the security here? So obviously, security team will say they own the security, and this, I think, is why we're seeing identity and access management teams roll up under the security team. Moreover, like kind of as the years go on, that usually ends up rolling up under the CISO because of the understood risk of these problems that can kind of like expand from this.
All right, diving in now to challenges and risks. We asked, what challenges does your organization experience with managing identity risk? We found that detecting privilege escalation or lateral movement, integrations, and automated threat detection were the major hurdles to managing identity risk.
One of the things that I think is really useful about the attack graph in general is that it kind of offers a map of the territory that is your environment, right? And so I often compare this to localized threat intelligence. It's less concerned. So imagine that threat intelligence often is asking, what is it that the attacker wants to do, right? And so in the context of the attack graph, it's less about what the attacker wants to do, and it's about what the attacker can do, right? So it's mapping out all those paths that they can take. One of the things that you start to think about is when you start talking about detection, right? Detecting privilege escalation, detecting identity-related threats. What you can do is you can kind of almost do, I think of the overhead projector in elementary school back in the day, where you have those overlays, the transparency overlays, and you kind of put them on top of each other. You take your traditional threat intelligence and you say, what are the things that the threat actors that we're worried about want to do? And then you overlay that with your attack graph, which says, these are the limitations of our environment that suggest what they can do. And now that helps you to prioritize where you're going to kind of spend your resources and things of that nature.
Yeah, I think this again gets boiled down to a visibility problem that Jared hit on earlier. Like, you can't detect what you can't see. So if you're blindly throwing out detections, trying to, detect the actor where they may come in. Again, back to my like ring doorbell on every open door. You're kind of guessing. Visibility of what the attacker can do kind of solves or illuminates a lot of these problems. Like, what's the risk of shadow IT and unmanaged identities? Well, we don't know what they would do with that. We don't know how hooked in they are to our systems and what some shadow IT provider could do to compromise the rest of our organization.
We next asked, which of the following security incidents has your organization experienced in the past year? And I do want to note that all respondents reported at least one in the past year, but the top 3 were ransomware infections, phishing attacks, or DDoS attacks.
I think it's interesting to kind of categorize each of these different incidents into 2 groups, right? So there's kind of this group of establishment of access or initial access. You have things like phishing, supply chain compromise, insider breach. software vulnerabilities being exploited. And then you have the traversal of attack paths, things like ransomware, malware infection, credential theft, account takeover. And so we go back to that idea of breaches are inevitable, but impactful breaches are avoidable. So there's an aspect to where, hey, a user is going to get phished, and that there's certain things that we can do to try to reduce the impact of that. But then the question is how do we limit the impact of that kind of inevitable, so to speak, initial access? And that's where we really try to focus with kind of this attack path approach.
I just say like overall, the security incident in the past 12 months is not surprising. When we deploy into customers, we use a metric called exposure. So how much of the environment, whether it be a domain or a tenant or whatever, has like how many users or identities have the ability to take over that environment? Meaning how many identities have the path to reach the most critical admin tier. So, domain admin or Azure global administrator. And on average, that's about 70% when we first deploy. So that means if I send 10 phishing emails and 10 people click on them, I have 7 valid attack paths to take over the entire environment. So it's a very target rich environment. It's not surprising that, the security incidents happen because usually once somebody gets in, they kind of can have their way with the environment.
We asked what the top 3 most critical threats or vulnerabilities to your organization was today. And I want to quickly just note that the percentages, if you actually look at this closely, the percentages on the right indicate that in the top case, phishing and social engineering, 38% of respondents put phishing and social engineering in their top 3. So again, the numbers on the right are indicative of sort of how many fit within the top 3. But phishing, insider threats, and credential theft or abuse were the threats that dominated the threat landscape.
I just think it's interesting that Shadow AI is down there at the bottom. We see Shadow IT, and we've known about that problem for a long time. It's going to be interesting how that Shadow AI problem kind of creeps back up over time.
For sure. Next up, what were the top 3 most critical threats or vulnerabilities, or what do you expect will be the most critical threats and vulnerabilities to your organization in the next 3 to 5 years? Identity risk came in at number 1, followed by exploited vulnerabilities in outdated systems and ransomware attacks.
Yeah, so again, just kind of reiterating one of the points that I made at the beginning of the presentation, we found that identity risk is really this abstract idea that organizations often struggle to kind of wrap their minds around. So if I were to ask you, what is your identity risk? You're like, well, I don't, 10, 7, I don't know what it is, right? And generally we think that attack paths are a really good way for us to kind of measure how identity risk manifests in an organization and makes itself like real, right? And so, for example, we can use attack paths to quantify the impact of a given identity if it were to be compromised. So imagine Justin's phishing example that he just gave, right? If this user is phished, this is what the impact of that would be. If this software is exploited or this vulnerability is exploited, this is what the impact of that is going to be downstream, right? And so this goes back to the how do we measure what the impact of a breach or of an incident would actually be.
Next, we're going to jump into understanding identity-based attack paths.
Oops, sorry.
Okay. We asked, which of the following tools does your organization use for mitigating identity-based attack paths? We found that organizations most commonly used endpoint detection and response tools, followed by PAM or privileged access management tools, and in third place coming in with identity and access management tools.
Next slide. Yeah, so this is an interesting insight that we've had recently, and we've been able to kind of put it into an analogy that I think is useful. One of the problems that we've run into in the past in our red team operations is organizations will have technologies like PAM, or they'll use MFA, or a lot of these kind of identity-centric solutions. And we find that despite the fact that they've rotated a password or that they've vaulted a user account, we're still able to leverage that account as part of our overarching attack path, right? And as we start to dig into that, we've found that there's kind of this paradigm or this paradigm that you could use to kind of describe the state of an identity. So imagine a lot of you are familiar with kind of this idea of data at rest versus data in transit, and the idea that despite the fact that you want to protect the data, the state of the data matters, right? So the way that you, for instance, apply encryption to data at rest is different than the way that you apply encryption to data in transit. So the same thing, the same kind of idea can be applied to identities. So imagine that you have an identity at rest. That would be like this user account, right? So the fact that a user account exists and has permissions over different resources, that's that identity at rest, right? You could log in and then now you've authenticated, and then you create what they call a session, right? And that session could be in the form of like a Windows session. It could be in the form of a browser session. It could be a SSH key, for instance. It could be all kinds of different things. And the way that you protect an identity at rest is going to be different than the way that you protect an identity in transit. If you go to the next slide, there was recently this compromise or incident that was related to Snowflake. And in the process of kind of talking about that incident, Snowflake and Mandiant, I believe, came out with some recommendations. And their recommendations for interventions for securing these accounts were apply MFA, right, to all accounts, but especially your privileged accounts, right? So again, we have that question of what is a privileged account? Apply network policy rules that, for instance, would limit access to a Snowflake tenant to only from the VPN or the corporate environment, right? So you can't just access it over the internet. And then like change how or like rotate your passwords, for instance. Those were the recommendations. But the problem here is that those are all security or interventions that are addressing the identity at rest, right? They're preventing somebody from logging in at the first time. The issue is that once the identity is logged in, right, and you've created that in transit session, now you have a whole different problem. None of MFA doesn't matter, right, because the MFA claim is already in the session. The password doesn't matter because it's already been authenticated, right? And so attackers are going to start targeting these in transit, or they already are targeting these in transit identities, and they're able to make progress as a result of that. So it's just a good way for us to think about how are we protecting our at-rest identities versus how do we protect our in-transit identities. The general idea is that most of our interventions are focused on securing at-rest identities, but the problem is that identities exist to be in transit, and so they're mostly in transit in your on-prem environments. And that's why on-prem environments are this really juicy target for attackers, because that's where they're going to get access to all the different resources that you have.
Yeah, I'll say that that's a significant portion of education that we have to do with a lot of customers is kind of explaining this residual risk of, yes, you've done all this great work to lock down accounts before they're used, and that is awesome. Like PAM is an amazing tool. You should use it. There is a residual risk that you are not aware of when that identity is in transit. Again, like we've taken advantage of this on red teams where an on-prem user will satisfy all these super advanced conditional access prompts and MFA, but then it drops a token on their machine and we just scoop up the token and then we are that person. So you have all this really good security that gets thwarted because you're unaware of this kind of the how the system works on the endpoint.
Right. We next asked, what types of assessments does your organization use to examine identity-based attack paths? And we found that automated attack path discovery, risk-based vulnerability assessments, and compliance-focused assessments were the top keys to examining attack paths.
I'd say like the question was prompted by like what types of assessment does your organization use to examine identity-based attack paths? Fortunately, this like the top respondents here was automated attack path discovery. But like assessments are good and they're good to show a view of the world at that time. But to really get control over this, you need something continuous. We used to do assessments that were kind of focused on trying to find attack paths, and we still do. And those can address some pretty severe issues. But really to kind of get a hold on this as your organization is changing day over day, I mean, one configuration can have such a dramatic effect. Like you can look good on one day and look completely terrible the next day because somebody put in the wrong configuration. So having view to that is absolutely critical.
We next asked, which of the following best describes your organization's use of identity-based attack path management solutions? And what we found is that over half of organizations, 59%, are actively researching or have even implemented an identity-based attack path management solution.
I'm gonna throw out in like an Andy Robbins brag because we kind of introduced this concept right in 2021. We were trying to figure out how to describe what we were about to release with BloodHound Enterprise, and so we called it attack path management. And I think it's just awesome to see that like us and others are helping people solve this problem because it's been the way that we and actual adversaries take advantage of most companies.
We asked, what benefits would you expect from an ideal identity-based attack path management process? And while there were quite a few different responses to this, reduced risk of successful cyber attacks came in at number one, improved visibility into privileged relationships at number two, and then better collaboration across security and IT teams came in at a close number three.
Yeah, I'm going to tell a story here that's probably, hopefully, sadly maybe familiar with to the audience, but think of an assessment where an assessor came in, did executed a pen test or a red team, came out with all these configuration changes, and then those were handed over to a security team who said, "Yep, that's really bad." Flips it over to the IT team, and then it hits a brick wall because there's no understanding of the possible outages that can be introduced by fixing problems. So there's this kind of gap of, well, we don't like, you don't understand what you'll break. You don't understand the security. It stalls, and then another year passes, and you get another test, and it just kind of recycles. That's a very pessimistic view of that, but we see that quite often. One thing that we found when customers use something like BloodHound Enterprise or probably other tools is you're speaking from the same sheet of music. There's no longer this kind of I don't understand the security implications of this, or I don't understand the IT implications of this. You're all kind of looking at the relationships and understanding the security problem, but also understanding what needs to change on the directory side to maintain the critical access that administrators need, but to remove the adversary's ability to abuse that.
And I think that top response kind of indicates to us that the respondents understand that breaches are inevitable, but impactful breaches are preventable, right? So the idea that by using approaches like attack path management, you're able to, for instance, sever the ability of an arbitrary incident from taking over your entire domain, right? So that's a really good kind of soft messaging response. Like we appreciate that view.
We next asked what folks' overall goals for their APM program was, or attack path management program was, over the next 12 months, if they did indeed have one or were on their way to creating one. And the top attack path management program priorities included integrations with existing security tools like a SIM, a SOAR, or identity and access management tool, improved visibility among identity relationships in relation to tier zero, and reduced number of critical or exploitable attack paths.
Yeah, I think like this view of identity and the attacks that you can do with identity is like a somewhat new thing for most companies, and so they want to integrate it as far as they can, right? They've had a lot of really good host data. They maybe have like a good application data, but this data around identities is very new. So it's no stranger to like no, it's not surprising that you would want to have that into every other tool. That's why actually this year, Bloodhound on the Bloodhound side, we've been trying to integrate with everything we possibly can. We've had a Splunk SIM integration for a long time. We just released a Splunk SOAR. We have a ServiceNow integration as well now. But you're going to see a lot of integrations because there's like workflows that people will want to hook into. So, for example, if you have an alert from a different system, whether that be a phishing like a phishing alert or an EDR alert, you can interrogate the identity graph to understand how bad that problem might be from the identity layer. So no surprise, it makes sense.
We asked, once attack paths and misconfigurations have been identified in your attack path management solution, what is your team's process for remediation or planned process if indeed you're building one? And we found that implementing controls where fixes have been delayed was the top response, followed by prioritized risk score or impact assessment, and then automated tools for remediation came in at number three.
Justin and I both have a background with the U.S. Air Force, and there's this saying that often comes up, which is mission first, people always. And the idea is you need to be solely focused on accomplishing your mission, but you need to make sure that you're taking care of the people that are required and that are helping you solve that, right? I think in this case, there's another analogy. You'll learn that I love those of remediate first, detect always, right? So when you have a finding in your attack path management solution, you should strive to try to fix that, right? But we understand that it's not always realistic that every finding will be remediated immediately, if at all, right? So there are situations to where that finding is representative of a necessary privilege or a necessary configuration. And so the question is how can you go about making compensating controls, right? And so we think that detection is a really good opportunity for this, but there's other ways that we could also work on compensating. It really also helps us to reify or make real this risk acceptance, right? So if I don't fix this finding, then I have to be confronted with what is the impact of that finding and what is the risk that I'm actually accepting. So for instance, if we don't fix this finding, we're accepting the risk that any domain user falling for a fish can result in a domain takeover. That's a little bit of a different decision than, oh, we have this abstract idea of that there's something wrong, but we're just going to kind of accept the risk and move on, right? If domain users are part of the domain admins group, you might actually want to fix that because you might not actually want to sign off on accepting that risk.
Yeah, it's why we tried to calculate the amount of attack paths or the amount of users that could use that attack path, because you don't want our opinion of like high, low, or medium based on how difficult or easy it is to use the attack path, or maybe what attackers have been observed being used in the wild. I want to hit on that point of observed. What you see in the wild may or may not be indicative of what attackers are actually using because that's only what's getting caught. So again, like those are all kind of flawed or imperfect ways of measuring risk. Really, what we like to do is understand the amount of people, which is like what Jared's analogy was. If domain users, everybody in the domain can use an attack path in an Active Directory environment, that's bad. That's way worse than one person in that domain. Or in an Azure tenant, same thing, right? If you can get initial access into the tenant and every principal within that tenant has the ability to take over to the tenant, that's obviously worse than a single attack path.
We next asked, what challenges did you experience or anticipate experiencing in implementing an attack path management process? And some of the top answers were prioritization difficulties, specifically around attack paths for remediation, and insufficient or outdated technology for managing those attack paths.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of hit on the importance of like prioritization and like having something real behind the word high or critical. I'd also say that like kind of an interesting thing is, I think around 10 years ago, a lot of people were like, well, AD is going away. We're all just going to move to Azure. So like, let's not learn AD anymore. And we've seen this kind of weird flip where, I mean, you've probably all heard of like the COBOL developers that give like ridiculous salaries because they're maintaining some legacy code, and maybe those are overblown. But it's kind of the same on Active Directory now. It's those admins are potentially retiring or going different routes, and so there's a lack of knowledge in Active Directory. New people are trying to grasp onto this and trying to like also keep up with the hybrid side. So I think the knowledge gap here can't be understated too. You're trying to learn this and then also learn how attackers are using it today versus yesterday. It's a lot to keep up with.
We surveyed the folks who had decided not to use an attack path management solution, And some of the top reasons for deciding not to included concerns about the complexity of deployment or use, limited availability of internal resources to actually manage such a tool, and a lack of budget to implement or maintain the solution.
I think perceived overlap is real. I mean, everybody's in identity security today, right? Like, look at any company and how they advertise themselves 3 years ago, and now everybody's an identity security company. So it's no surprise that everybody thinks that there's an overlapping technology that they might be covering some of this. Hopefully people are understanding that like an EDR is a necessary thing that you should have internally, but it's not necessarily directly responding to this problem. Same thing with PAM. PAM is a very necessary, very good technology, but it's not addressing this problem. The lack of budget and like to implement, yeah, of course, we all have that concern. I think the complexity of deployment and use, yes, this has to be up and fast, right? And it has to scale. So it has to look at not just like a single environment. It has to like some of these companies are gigantic with like I think one of our customers has I think the top numbers are somewhere around 200 domains. And plus like all their Azure tenants. It gets pretty wild. So the ability to scale and kind of pick out what matters across that global footprint is incredibly important. Luke, were you gonna cover this or you want me to cover
Uh,
it?
yeah, if you can cover it, that'd
Oh
be
yeah,
great.
sure. So long story short, like this is why we think attack path management is this kind of missing component. These all these things that you have in your identity security stack, whether they be privilege access management, IGAs like SailPoint, ITDR, directory hygiene, making sure like the domain is updated and that kind of stuff, or basic checks like also like external attack surface management. Those are all great, but there is this area that we use as attackers and attackers use every day. We have this opinion that most breaches today use some form of identity attack path. If you read them closely, you can understand how there was an initial access, then they pivoted, and they can like if they'll go through the details. And if you've watched a couple of our webinars, you've probably seen us debrief them. I mean, Andy did a really popular one last year, but we do them as much as we can to make this problem real. And this is why we think attack path management is the answer to this. We're directly answering or directly taking away the routes that we as adversaries or attackers use today. And moreover, this doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't have to be an abstract attack path, red team penetration testing concept. We're taking advantages of that lack of separation that you think you put in place. So you think you've separated your admins from your users, and we are taking advantages of relationships that you don't know exist that allow us to route through that. So again, you have tried to implement segmentation, and we're showing you where you have not. I think I kind of covered this basically, but yeah,
I
go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say one of the things that we've been hearing across the industry and from customers is that there are so many players in the identity space that it's really important to ask a vendor what they actually do to understand where they might fit into your identity security stack. So looking ahead, we asked, what areas does your organization see the greatest need for innovative cyber technology from startups beyond the major vendors? And we found that startup innovation is most needed in OT or IoT, identity security, and data security. We asked the importance of a number of different scenarios were for selecting an identity-based attack path management partner or solution. And the vendor selection criteria included compatibility with existing tools, the ease of deployment, the quality of reports, and the scalability for organizational growth.
I hit on this earlier, the ease of deployment and scalability. But one thing I do want to highlight is about halfway down, there's this ongoing support and customer service. That's really key. Like you're not just really selecting a tool, you're selecting a partner. So who's going to be supporting that? What is their process for supporting that product? And over the long term, right? Who's going to help you interpret the results if that's necessary? It's all really important. And what's their background? How do they feel qualified to do that kind of stuff? That's something that we try to do. We take very seriously, obviously on the BloodHound Enterprise side, but I'd say like in general, for any product, it doesn't matter if it's attack path management or otherwise. Understanding how the team is going to support it is obviously extremely critical. Oops, sorry, I went too fast.
We asked about frequency, how often organizations evaluate attack path management within their identity environments. Key takeaway here is 84% of companies are evaluating attack paths daily. 39% are multiple times per day.
Yeah, I think attack path management is a battle against entropy. So imagine that a clean attack graph or a properly configured tiered environment is not a natural state of being, right? It takes a lot of work to get there. And so then you have to think about every change that an admin is going to make or every install of some new system or some new capability is more likely to create more risk than it is to reduce risk, right? And so that's why this continuous approach is so important, is because everything that happens is more likely to make things worse than it is to make it better. And so it's your job to constantly kind of fight against nature, right? And make sure that we're maintaining the configuration that we've worked so hard to kind of get.
I think this is promising too, because people are understanding that there needs to be a capability internally to focus on this problem, and like 84% are saying that they do that, which is good.
Next, we asked challenges or gaps in your current attack path management solution might hinder your effectiveness. We found that real-time attack path detection was the #1 challenge or gap, followed by better prioritization of risks and remediation actions and automated remediation capabilities.
I'll say that the automated remediation capabilities is really dangerous. There's some things that you might want to leave to a human. There are things that we've seen customers automate through the use of SOAR to, there's certain attack paths that can be remediated really quickly. But for the vast majority, you're probably going to want a human in that loop. I'd also say support for hybrid environments is a no-brainer. We don't live in an on-prem world anymore, so you're gonna, and your identities, like I personally, me as a human, have multiple identities at SpecterOps, and it's incredibly important to understand that risk, and make sure that that solution can capture that risk.
We asked what the most concerning attack path your teams have uncovered using an attack path management tool was, and more than a quarter of respondents said that the exploitation of cloud misconfigurations was the most concerning attack path.
There's this big trend of attackers going straight to, like, direct to cloud, right? And that makes sense because attackers are going to try to avoid the place where your organization's security stack is, which is largely on-prem, right? But it's important for us to remember that conversation about the at-rest versus in-transit identities. There's lots of ways for us to secure those at-rest identities, right? The Snowflake example, we talk about the network policy rules. You can only access the Snowflake tenant if you're on the VPN, for instance, if you're coming from the on-prem environment. Things like PAM and password rotation and MFA. And so there's going to be, and then you start to think about where, like Justin just mentioned, I have all these cloud identities that I'm operating from. The question is where are you using those cloud identities when you're logging in? Where are you establishing those in transit sessions? And Justin, what's your answer?
On sorry, repeat the question. Where am
Yeah,
I establishing those?
yeah. Where are you establishing like your sessions from?
On-prem, like on your host.
From your like centrally managed data processing laptop, right? And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
so at the end of the day, that's always going to be a juicy target for attackers because that's where they're going to be able to get that access sprawl or that accumulation, that snowball, right, of accumulation of privilege.
I think I shared this at a very recently, but everybody's really concerned about the cloud, and I think that there's that kind of will never go away. There's always new and like interesting things that cloud providers are introducing, and how does that affect our security? And it's like the unknown unknown. I'll say that like from our perspective, the biggest risk to cloud environments is your on-prem environment and connecting the two, because you have all the risk of the legacy plus all the risk of the open-ended, like I can get to the cloud from my home too. So yeah, having visibility of those hybrid paths is incredibly important.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A. If you have a burning question for us, please go ahead and insert it into the Q&A or raise your hand and we'll call on you. Let me open it up here.
I think yeah,
What
we
are
should
the
we should make sure we have let's get the questions through Q&A. I don't think we'll like
Yeah. What are the capabilities to investigate network mapping services configuration by attackers, as well as access to nodes on that network? For example, attackers mapping network endpoints, even if they don't have privileged access to resources on that node. Is that part of an overall risk profile for attack path management?
ooh,
You want me
network.
to repeat that?
If you can, maybe in chat, I don't know if I'm going down the right route, but are you asking like detecting if somebody's mapping the network internally, or are you trying to say like who has network access to things? Maybe Jared, if you understand that question,
Yeah, I mean, I'll go with the first interpretation of what you were asking.
okay.
If I was an attacker, I'd want to know what was on the network. Yeah, so I imagine that in attacker tradecraft, there's probably several categories, but let's act like there's two categories of different tradecraft. One is situational awareness, right? The other is actually executing that attack path, right? So in the attack graph, every edge, or there's actually different categories of edges. There's what we call transparent edges, so like a member of edge, where a user is a member of a group. That's a transparent edge. Nothing ever, like the attacker doesn't have to do anything to traverse that edge to go from the user to the group. But the non-transparent edges, you actually have to perform some sort of tradecraft to traverse that edge, right? So that's one category. The other is situational awareness of how I build the graph. I would say that attack path management is primarily focused on reducing the opportunities for the first category of tradecraft, which is how do I traverse the edges, not necessarily how do I build the graph, right? Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't have strategies or detection strategies, for instance, to identify when somebody's trying to build that graph. It's just not really the focus of attack path management.
I think
Uh,
we have time for one more. Do you have advice for how to bridge the gap between identity and security teams? Our AD team takes care of remediation. We find the problems, but it's not always clear to them what the priorities are.
well, so there was like between IAM and security teams, but then our AD team. So that's actually three different teams in my head. So you have like the IAM team who's provisioning access, typically at least, and then like the AD team who's taking care of AD, and the security team who's concerned about the problem. Uh, what the priorities for us. I mean, first, like you should all be speaking from the same sheet of music. I mean, like you should be looking at some list of problems, whether they come from a pen test report or from an attack path management product like ours. But it's important to like make sure you're all looking at that at the same time. As silly as that sounds, what we usually see is people are tossing problems back and forth. It's incredibly important to make sure that you understand that the AD team has or Azure team, whatever it might be, that fixing an attack path could be removing privilege and potentially breaking something. And so it's important to understand first the priority of the problem. So what is an attacker? How bad is this? Like how many people could get to this particular attack path? But really, it's well, what damage could it entertain in our environment if we removed it? So like that has to be a two-way street. We've tried to highlight like what we call low-hanging fruit. There's some certain attack paths you can rip out with very little concern because they have little follow-on effect. So it's important to understand that kind of like the Venn diagram of easy to fix and very impactful, and make sure you understand where those cross by having a conversation between all those teams.
Thank you. Justin, Jared, we are at time. I appreciate the questions and the attention from all of you who've been on the line with us. Again, the recording and slides from this will be shared with everyone who registered shortly after we conclude. And from that, I wish you all a great rest of your days. Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.